In 1895, the United States was a country experiencing rapid growth, looking with excitement towards the new millennium. This progress included the formation of new institutes for higher learning and the establishment of state-owned and private universities, as well as new sources of recreation and sport for their students. One of these sports was a relatively recent innovation developed from British rugby, the game of football. The first collegiate football battle was staged by Rutgers and Princeton universities in 1869. Football had fans among the students, but not the faculty, who disliked the brutal nature of the game. In the 1800s, football was considered violent and dangerous. Helmets were not worn, although the Spalding Brothers Company sold a knit cap which it advertised as an absolute protection for sore ears. Accusations of professionals joining football teams were common. Rosters were stocked with the best players, though few actually enrolled. The violence, cheating, and professionalism prompted one man to take action. Purdue University President James H. Smart called a meeting of his Midwestern peers on January 11, 1895, to consider the regulation and control of intercollegiate athletics. He was joined by the university presidents of Illinois, Minnesota, and Wisconsin, Chicago, Northwestern, and Lake Forest College. They set up a plan to organize collegiate athletics.
The Big Ten was made up of faculty representatives in the years past and still is. The faculty representatives, however, really used to run the conference. They were the ones that were the policy formers, the philosophy people. They made the standards for academics, standards for eligibility, and all the things that go along with the playing of the game.
The group met again at the Powerhouse in Chicago in 1896, where Lake Forest was replaced by the University of Michigan. They designated themselves the Intercollegiate Conference of Faculty Representatives. Throughout the next 100 years, however, the moniker would change to the Western Conference and eventually the Big Ten. The conference leaders developed a list of rules aimed to rid the schools of the abuses rampant in sports. Football underwent many changes in the 1880s, primarily due to the influence of the father of American football, Walter Camp of Yale. One of Camp's star players made Casper Whitney's first ever All-American team in 1888. This man had a greater impact on Western Conference football than any other person. His name? Amos Alonzo Stagg. Stagg was hired by the University of Chicago in 1892 as football coach, athletic director, and as an associate professor. Before this, academic status for a coach was unheard of.
He was an innovator. He did a lot of things, develop it. I think his greatest attribute was the respect that he got from all the men that played under him or competed under him.
Patrick John O'Day came to the University of Wisconsin to join his brother, the school's crew coach at Madison. O'Day had been a football star in Australia and led the Badgers to the first ever football conference championship. In 1899, Indiana University and the State University of Iowa were admitted into the conference. A new name was coined for the new century, the Big Nine. In Ann Arbor, a young but accomplished football coach arrived to take over the Wolverine squad. Fielding H. Yost. His players said the H stood not for Harris, but for hurry up. Yost brought with him halfback Willie Heston, the first nationally known college football star. Yost's point-a-minute team racked up 550 points the first year, not allowing the opponents a single score. Michigan's 1901 season culminated in a New Year's Day invitation to play in the first game at the Festival of Roses in Pasadena, California, the Rose Bowl. Stanford also came into the game undefeated. Fullback Neil Snow's 5 touchdowns led Michigan to a 49-0 rout of the Cardinals.
In that game, Yost only played 11 men, and he said when they reached 50 points, he would put substitutes in. And Unfortunately, Stanford opted to end the game before the 60 minutes was up.
The festival committee, upset by the result, canceled the football game for the next 14 years, replacing it with more popular events like chariot races, polo pony races, and tent pegging. From 1901 to 1905, Michigan outscored its opponents 2,821 to 40. The team went 55 consecutive games without a loss. But the 1903 Minnesota game ended in a 6-all tie. Since that day, these two teams have been fighting the battle of the Little Brown Jug, the oldest trophy of its kind. While great strides had been made in athletic reform, President Teddy Roosevelt demanded that colleges take further action to prevent the huge number of football injuries. In 1906, the NCAA was formed to set up stricter rules governing college sports. The biggest change brought on by the new rules was the legalization of the forward pass. The Big Nine also created more rules of its own. Unhappy with some of the reforms its own president, Angell, helped to promote, the University of Michigan withdrew from the Big Nine. Illinois Athletic Director George Huff hired Robert Zupke to coach his football team. In only his second year, Illinois won its first outright title and national recognition. In 29 years of coaching, Zupp won or shared 7 Big Ten titles and 3 national championships. Creating the huddle and such plays as the flea flicker, the Little Dutchman created the most modern version of the game ever seen. The Ohio State University joined the league in 1913. In 1918, the University of Michigan rejoined the Western Conference, and it became the Big Ten. In 15 prior meetings, the Buckeyes had managed only 3 touchdowns against Michigan. In their first conference matchup, Charles W. Chick Harley took his team to Ann Arbor and finally beat the Wolverines 9-7. Undefeated Ohio State was invited to play at the Rose Bowl after the 1920 season, the first for the Big Ten since Michigan's 1902 rout. After the Buckeyes' 28-0 beating by California, the Big Ten did not permit any team to return to Pasadena for the next 25 years.
When we played, we were not permitted to play a postseason game or any postseason sport, actually, because you lost your eligibility.
As football increased in popularity and revenue, schools felt pressure to recruit top athletes, and the larger crowds needed places to cheer on their teams. The University of Wisconsin had a stadium, but many spectators were injured when a section of the wooden stands collapsed. In 1917, the university received $15,000 in funding to build Camp Randall, a new concrete stadium, the first in the Big Ten.
The attendance figures are always paced by Big Ten teams because of the great interest and the great stadiums and field houses that grace the campuses around the Big Ten.
The other schools soon followed suit. The famous Horseshoe at Ohio, Memorials at Illinois and Minnesota, Dyke at Northwestern, Ross-Ade at Purdue, and the Big House, Michigan Stadium, were all built within 10 years of Camp Randall. In 1921, Iowa football began to experience its own golden age. Under coach Howard Jones, the Hawkeyes were superb. The team starred quarterback Aubrey Devine and tackle Fred Duke Slater. Slater played his entire career without a helmet. The season marked Iowa's first undefeated year and outright title, and a Rose Bowl invitation which it could not accept. Once again, the Big Ten set a standard of leadership. In 1922, it established the office of Commissioner of Athletics. The first commissioner, Major John L. Griffith, served for 22 years. At Illinois, Bob Zupke's 1921 squad upset Ohio State. Working so hard for the victory, they became known as the Fighting Illini. The next year began the career of one of the most dazzling players in football, Harold "Red" Grange. Grange became such a dominant player that sports writer Grantland Rice wrote a poem in his honor. A streak of fire, a breath of flame, eluding all who reach and clutch. A gray ghost thrown into the game that rival hands may never touch. Thus began the legend of the Galloping Ghost. Number 77's most incredible game took place at the Memorial Stadium dedication in 1924 against the Wolverines. On the first play, Grange took the kickoff return 95 yards for a score. In 12 minutes, Grange touched the ball 4 times and scored 4 touchdowns. Yost called the Michigan team of 1925 his best ever. Offense on that team was led by the great passing combination of quarterback Benny Friedman and end Benny Oosterbaan. Paraphrasing P.T. Barnum, Yost told Friedman, "There's a sucker born every minute, Benny, so don't be afraid to pass on first down." The most dominant player as the 20s closed was Bronco Nagurski of Minnesota. He played every position except quarterback, center, and halfback, and was the force behind handing Notre Dame its first home loss in 22 years. An All-American at both tackle and fullback, no one could stop him. Even Red Grange said, "When it comes to picking the greatest player ever, there is no contest. It's the Bronx." 1929 began a decade marked by great change. Purdue won its first conference title in an undefeated season. Coach James Phelan and All-American triple-threat halfback Ralph Pest Welch led the Purdue team to its only victory over Michigan in 37 years. A fourth quarter, 24-point rally by the Boilermakers. 2 touchdowns from Welch shocked the Ann Arbor crowd, and Purdue took home a 30-16 win. 3 teams dominated the 30s: Michigan, Minnesota, and Northwestern. The Wildcats experienced the greatest years in their history. The 1930 and 31 teams were coached by Dick Hanley. In those years, he had the share of 2 Big Ten championships and 8 All-Americans. The Wildcats almost went 2 unbeaten seasons. In 1930, a loss to Notre Dame spoiled hopes of the national championship. In 1931, Northwestern finished the regular season undefeated. Then, the Big Ten set up 5 postseason charity games to help out the Depression-ravaged country. The night before their contest with Purdue, several Wildcat players were shaken up when their elevator fell out of control. They lost the game and the undisputed title. A bigger loss occurred the next year. Stagg reached 70, mandatory retirement age at Chicago.
I was a freshman his last year at the university, and we were all disappointed. We were unhappy. We didn't know what would happen. We were in a turmoil, really.
The Chicago athletic program never recovered, but Stagg continued on. The grand old man coached football until the age of 98 and lived to be 103. Coached by Harry Kipke, Michigan shared the 30 and 31 titles with Northwestern. His team starred the first of 3 Wistert brothers at tackle.
Whitey was All-American in 1933, Albert or Ox in 1942, and I achieved that same recognition in 1948 and 1949, and I was also captain in 1949.
Kipke's boys became the undisputed champs in 1932 and 33. The center and MVP on the 34 team was Jerry Ford, who later became President of the United States.
I saw him years afterwards, and he pointed to his cheek and said he had a scar there that he got when he got my heel or my cleat in the face when he tried to tackle me. And I said, "Well, Jerry, if that was the case, you didn't tackle me, did you?"
The captain of the 1916 Minnesota Norsemen, Bernard W. Bierman, returned as the team's coach in 1932.
One of the all-time greats, and he's done things that nobody else has been close to being able to equal here.
From Bierman's first championship in 1934, Minnesota did not face much competition, and certainly not from the University of Chicago. However, there was one player on the Maroons team who has his name in all of the history books. John Jacob J. Berwanger was captain, league MVP, and an All-American. Simply the best back in the country. He compiled incredible statistics on a team that never had a winning season.
He's the greatest football player, halfback, that I've ever seen. He did everything. He passed, he kicked, he ran, he made 3/4 of their tackles on defense. He was a tremendous football player.
I became known as the man with the iron mask because I had broken my nose in high school, my last game, and also as a freshman, and the doctors over at Billings Hospital at the universities advised me that if I didn't have some protection for my nose when I was playing ball, that I wouldn't have a nose.
At the end of the 35 season, New York's Downtown Athletic Club presented an award named after Georgia Tech coach John Heisman. The first winner of the Heisman Trophy was Jay Berwanger.
I found out that I won it by receiving a telegram at the fraternity house saying that I'd won the trophy, and that they were sending me 2 tickets to fly to New York, one for myself, one for my coach. Well, my biggest thrill at that moment was that this was going to be my first airplane ride.
In 1936, Minnesota's 28-game undefeated streak was finally broken by Lynn Pappy Waldorf's Wildcats, who won their first and only undisputed Big Ten title.
Last season with the Gophers, I played in a Northwestern game, and I was penalized there for roughing, which gave Northwestern the game gave them the ball on the 1-yard line, and they beat us 6-0. We should have won the ball game, but didn't.
The Associated Press introduced a new national championship poll that year, choosing Minnesota even with the loss. Pappy Waldorf was still a winner, selected as the first Coach of the Year. 1939 holds the distinction of being the beginning of the modern era in Big Ten athletic competition. Chicago, winless the previous 2 seasons, played only 3 games before discontinuing its football program entirely. Iowa hired Dr. Eddie Anderson to coach football at the princely sum of $10,000 a year. Anderson regularly used only 13 or 14 men a game, and these Iron Men of Iowa were led by Niall Clark Kinnick Jr. Kinnick scored 107 of his team's 130 points that season. Of 19 total touchdowns, he threw for 11 and ran in 5. Drop-kicked 11 points after and led the nation in kick returns and interceptions. He was also the second Big Ten player to win the Heisman Trophy. Sadly, Kinnick was lost at sea during World War II. Former Minnesota coach Herbert Orrin Chrysler was hired by Yost to restore Michigan to glory. He had spent his playing days with Stagg at Chicago.
He went out for football, but he quit. And he's walking across campus one day after he had quit, and Stagg went by him on a bike and said, "There's one thing I never thought you would be, and that was to be a quitter." And that motivated Fritz to go back out for football.
He had always had this way of saying that it's on defense, it's reckless abandon, and on offense, poise and concentration, you know. And you look at the sequence of coaches there, and you get Fritz Chrysler at the Benny Eustabarn, the Bump Elliott, Michigan people, so to speak, because from the Chrysler era.
Chrysler inherited an incredible athlete known as Old Number 98. Tom Harmon was the nation's top rusher. Forrest Evashevsky blocked for Harmon every step of the way. In Harmon's time, the Wolverines lost only 4 games, but 3 were to the Gophers, resulting in a shutout from the conference title. But in his 3 years at Michigan, Harmon broke most of Red Grange's Big Ten records. In his final game in 1940, Harmon ran for 3 touchdowns, passed for 2, and nabbed an interception in the 40-0 rout of the Buckeyes. Harmon capped his career by winning the Heisman Trophy. 2 years in a row for the Big Ten. Bruce Smith followed as the next Heisman winner in 1941. as Bierman added another halfback sensation to his list of All-Americans. The last season before wartime rules impacted college football was 1942. Ohio State was under the direction of a second-year coach right out of the high school ranks by the name of Paul Brown. Illinois, under coach Ray Elliott, produced sophomore All-American lineman Alex Agassi. Agassi was called the Wandering Guard since he was sent to Purdue for officer training in '43 and was an All-American again. He returned to Indiana after the war and in 1946 became a three-time honoree. The Wolverine squad was full of military transfers, including Elroy Crazy Legs Hirsch, the first four-sport letterman.
Elroy Hirsch, the former Wisconsin All-American, he played at two schools in the days when you were taken, you could just go from one to another because there just weren't many players around.
They made the rule that if you're on the campus and in uniform, you were eligible to play sports. The manpower was low anyway. So we got to play sports at Michigan.
Northwestern coach Pappy Waldorf produced a star of his own, a versatile athlete who actually believed basketball was his better game. Otto Graham was called the ideal running, passing threat by his coach. Throughout his football career at Northwestern, he scored 115 points, half the total of the entire team.
Otto Graham is probably the best football player that Northwestern ever had. If I'm not mistaken, he played in both the single wing tailback and then when they went to the T formation as a T quarterback.
Well, in a single wing, the tailback does a lot of the action. In other words, he carries the ball probably more than anybody else. He does most of the passing and that type of thing. And he could even call plays if he wanted to.
In 1944, when Coach Brown left for the Navy, he named assistant Carol Widows to take over at Ohio State. Team captain Les Horvath returned from the Army and enrolled in dental school. With a team full of teenagers, Horvath ran and passed his way to the Bucks' first perfect season in 24 years. At the end of the year, he was MVP and Ohio State's first Heisman recipient. Indiana's coach Alvin Nugent Bo McMillan had been running things in Bloomington since 1934. In '45, his poor little boys finally got their first undefeated season and championship, with Coach of the Year honors in a landslide for Bo.
Indiana was outstanding, and it was right near the end of the war. They put it together, and they won the whole thing.
In 1946, the University of Chicago finally withdrew from the conference, admitting that it was no longer able to compete in Big Ten athletics. The conference entered into a new, closed contract with the Pacific Coast Conference for postseason Rose Bowl play.
I think that is a great classic game. The best game in the country, in my opinion, even better than any playoff game they can have. That I think year in and year out, the Rose Bowl is the class of all the bowl games and class of college football.
1946, which I think was the first year that the Big Ten went back into the Rose Bowl pack. In 1946, Illinois went back.
Illinois, with the returning Agassi, won the honor to play in the first nationally televised college football game. UCLA was highly rated, but proved no match for the Illini, who won easily, 45-14. One of the rule changes during the war dealt with substitution of players.
The players had to go both ways in those days. You played offense, and then defense, you turned around and went over on defense. So, and thank goodness that two-platoon system came in and saved a lot of football lives.
Chrysler made the most of it at Michigan, developing the two-platoon system. His offensive stars were All-American halfbacks Bob Chappius, MVP Chalmers Bump Elliott, and his brother Pete. They led the Wolverines to the team's first title in 15 years.
The team that we played on was undefeated and untied, played in the Rose Bowl. We beat Southern California 49-0, and it seemed like everything went well. And the secret to that team was it was a group of people that were made up of a little bit older, a little bit more mature.
After the game, a California sports writer wrote, "Michigan isn't so hot, they haven't improved in 46 years. It was the same score in 1902. The AP took another vote after our bowl game, and by a 2-to-1 vote, picked Michigan #1.
Chrysler stepped aside the next year to become athletic director and handed the reins to Benny Oosterbaan.
Fritz was a taskmaster. He brooked no mistakes. I have always felt that he demanded professional performance from rank amateurs. Where Benny was have fun, but at that time you had to be absent 2 years from the Rose Bowl before you could go back. So although we were voted national champions in '48, we went nowhere.
So Michigan, having played in the previous year, it would go to the runner-up, and that turned out to be Northwestern. And Northwestern played against California, and Northwestern won the game 20-14 on a disputed touchdown. Art Markowski fumbled either just as he hit the plane of the goal line or just before.
I was head linesman, and I was on the line in that game. And while Markowski drove in the line, I went like this because he was over, and he fumbled. The ball came in the end zone, and California recovered. And then the newspapers had pictures taken from the end zone, and they said it wasn't a touchdown. Fortunately, a couple of weeks later, I got a letter from one of the faculty members of the California, and they said a group of them were sitting on the goal line, and they saw the play, and they said I was right, and that helped, made me feel better. I knew I was right, but it helped to know that someone else also knew I was right.
Filling the hole left by Chicago's withdrawal, the conference admitted Michigan State College into its ranks in 1949.
A lot of people were thinking that it might have been the University of Pittsburgh or the University of Nebraska. But our people chose Michigan State to join the conference and make it the Big Ten again.
It was a real big deal, celebrations in the streets, major headlines in the paper. The students went absolutely berserk. They'd been waiting for this for so long.
In 1950, Ohio State player turned coach Wes Fessler had his star halfback, All-America MVP and Heisman Trophy winner Vic Janowitz. He also hoped to earn a Rose Bowl bid.
It was, as most people know, the Snow Bowl, and spawned the roses that bloomed in the snow. So, well, finally, and then there were reports, of course, that some people wanted to call the game off because of the tremendous snow. And the snow was deep, you know, and it was really cold. It was about 5 to 10 degrees above zero. You know, all through the game, people were with brooms out there sweeping the sidelines and sweeping the yard line markers. And as you may well know from reading about it, you know, we won the game. We blocked a kick for a safety, and we blocked one for a touchdown and won the game 9-3. Yeah, there were 45 punts in that game. But our center, Carl Krager, did not make a bad pass that whole game. He played the whole game, and he didn't wear any gloves. But that really was a big part of the game.
The new conference man, Biggie Munn, was determined to prove that his Michigan State team deserved its membership in the Big Ten.
A tough taskmaster, great competitor, but I think maybe being as motivational as he was, I think maybe this was his key.
Football had been played by the Aggies since the late 1800s, but in the 1950s, the Spartans proved they could compete.
Certainly football, with Clarence Biggie Munn, the head coach, the Spartans in that period went on a 28-game winning streak, and amongst the successes, the fact that they won a national championship in '52, they placed second in the national polls in '51.
Unfortunately, they did not play a full conference schedule until 1953. So Coach of the Year Munn stayed home while Wisconsin took the trip to Pasadena. Wisconsin had its first share of the league title in 40 years, due mostly to the powerful running of Allen the Horse Amici. The next year, when the Big Ten disallowed two-platoon football, Amici added linebacker to his list of accomplishments and became Wisconsin's first Heisman Trophy winner. One of the first in the great tradition of linemen at Illinois was Ray Nitschke.
I knew I wanted to play in the best conference in the country, and I wanted to go to school in the Midwest, and I was fortunate to go to a state university, University of Illinois. It says, this is incredible to go, you know, to play in the Big Ten. I gained 170 yards against Northwestern in my last game at the University of Illinois. And I know I see Bo Schembecker every now and then, and he says, Ray, boy, you had to be the slowest running back that ever played. But I'll tell you, you know, he was on the coaching staff at Northwestern with Eric Parseason, and he can appreciate that run I made.
A new man was brought into Columbus out of the cradle of coaches, Miami of Ohio. His name, Wayne Woodrow Woody Hayes. Woody's well-known coaching philosophy was 3 yards in a cloud of dust. In his 27 seasons at Ohio State, Woody created one of the most dominant programs in the history of college football.
He was as great a coach as a teacher. This man was the best teacher I ever saw in football, because he would break down every little thing that you ought to do. Everybody thought his teams would be easy to beat because they were so predictable. They were predictable, but brother, they executed better than anybody else. They didn't make mistakes, they didn't beat themselves, and they knew how to block and tackle.
He made no bones about the fact that he wanted to win football games. He liked competition. He liked competing, and he wanted to win.
Korean War regulations allowed freshmen back on the field, and halfback Howard Hopalong Cassidy was one of the best. In his last 2 years, Cassidy won just about every award: MVP, All-American, Maxwell, UPI Player of the Year, and the Heisman. Running roughshod over its opponents, Ohio State won the league title and national championships in 1954 and 57.
I always remember standing on the sideline and looking at Hopalong Cassidy during a timeout or something, and he stood out there as if to say, I don't care if we get beat 100-0, I'm going to still be here.
Another successful coach of the 50s was former Michigan player Forrest Evashevsky.
Evie came in and he ran a marvelous program. He was a genius as a football coach and a genius as a motivator, and Iowa had 2 Rose Bowl winners. He had Kenny Payne out of Clinton, who I would think was the best Iowa quarterback as a total athlete of 52 years in covering Iowa.
Coach Murray Warmoth built a solid team at Minnesota by 1960.
Well, we were voted the national champions after the 1960 season, and that meant more than anything. We played in the Rose Bowl that year and played Washington. That was a great thrill.
Wisconsin coach Milt Brune had a team that could score, led by quarterback Ron Vanderkellen. 1962 was the Badgers' year.
One of the finest games I saw played was Wisconsin in the Rose Bowl in 1963, 42-37. Southern California won the game, but the Badgers put on one of the finest rallies I've ever seen.
Going into that game, we thought, we had a good offensive group. They had a powerful team, good matchup. We started off slowly. All of a sudden, you find yourself down 42-14. It turned out that game came down to the last play. The punt was almost blocked. I think that would have been almost just hard to believe. And we end up on the short end of the stick in the game. But the amazing thing about that, I think that game points up the real value in entertainment aspect of sports. Regardless of where you go, people remember that game and they'll say, gee, what a great football game. Really enjoyed myself. I had a great time.
Illinois came back from a 10-year drought in 1963 under the coaching of former Michigan star Pete Elliott. The Illini team was led by the fantastic sophomore running back Jim Grabowski.
As I was gaining more and more yardage, there was talk about me breaking Red Grange's record, and I got a letter from Red when I broke those records, and it was really a memorable thing for me, and it's a keepsake that I have in my office today, that a letter from the great Red Grange.
At center and linebacker was one of the most feared and respected players in the game, Dick Butkus.
Dick was just maybe the best football player I ever played with, and certainly the best linebacker by a long shot.
And this guy was so good on a bad team that Northwestern had plays set up to misdirect Butkus. They didn't care about the other 10 guys. As long as they could get Butkus moving the wrong way, they would take their chances with the other 10. I never saw that in football before.
Pete's brother Bump was running the Michigan program at the same time, and the former teammates were on opposite sides of the field.
While I was here, Bump always beat Pete, okay? But they were caring brothers. When they walked out on the field, they stared at each other, and I think this was the way they lived their life, you know. I think they always competed against each other.
We played each other, I think, 6 times, and they were always great games. I really felt like before the game, there's no game that I would like to win more than the game against Illinois, and if we were fortunate enough to win, then I felt far worse about winning the game than if we had lost.
Duffy Daugherty's 1965 Spartan team turned out to be one of the best ever.
Well, the Michigan State team in 1965 had some of the best athletes ever assembled, I think. They had guys like Bubba Smith and Gene Washington and Clinton Jones and on and on and on.
Defensively especially, those teams, oftentimes 4 or 5 games in a row, opponents would get negative yardage.
In '66, the team went all the way to the season finale and then played Notre Dame in the so-called Battle of the Century, and that game ended in the famous 10-10 tie.
It's almost 30 years now since that 10-10 tie, and people still talk about that. I mean, that's still party talk wherever you go.
Football continued to evolve in every aspect during the 1960s.
To me, I think the Big Ten 25, 30 years ago was an opening for a lot of minority players to hone their athletic skills and their academic skills, because the Alabama, Mississippi, and those schools in the South were not recruiting black ball players. So quite naturally, they all were either in the Big Ten.
Bob Greasy was one of the first of the great option quarterbacks who could run or pass with equal skill.
In all of the years that the Big Ten had been going to the granddaddy of all the bowl games, there were only 2 schools that had never been to the Rose Bowl, and that was Indiana and Purdue, arch rivals. We were the 2nd best team in the conference that year, and we went to the Rose Bowl and beat Southern Cal, who was the best team in the Pac-10.
Indiana found victory in '67 and kept snatching it out of the jaws of defeat. Coach John Pont led his Cardiac Kids to their first ever Rose Bowl bid. 1968 was the last year for Woody Hayes as a solo act. Woody created a monster of a squad that year called his Super Team. They easily dished out losses to each opponent on their way to the national championship. Enter at Michigan, Glenn Bo Schembechler, a player and assistant for Hayes. He had learned well.
I was always known as a protege of his. Matter of fact, they used to call me Little Woody, you know that. And they all thought that upset me, but it didn't. Hey, there's nobody I'd rather beat than Woody Hayes. I really believe there's nobody he'd rather beat than me. And that's what made that rivalry so great.
Bo took on the invincible Buckeyes, and the student beat his teacher. Michigan traveled to Pasadena for the Rose Bowl. Then tragedy occurred.
I couldn't get up for the game. And for me, as an emotional person, not being able to do that, that told me there was something pretty serious wrong. And Dr. Haskell Weinstein, I'll never forget his name, I think he's passed away now, came in and said, "Coach, you're out of the game." And I said, "No way." And he says, "Yeah, you're out of the game. You've had a heart attack."
Michigan crumbled, a bad omen for their postseason play over the next decade. In the 70s, people didn't refer to the conference as the Big Ten. By football standards, it was the Big Two and the Little Eight.
There wasn't any question the 2 best year in and year out were Michigan and Ohio State. But that is not to the detriment of those other 8 teams. It's just that I believe that those 2 teams during that particular time were far and away the best in the league.
At that time in Big Ten history, one man stands out from all others, Archie Griffin.
In the Woody Hayes system, he was exactly right for it. He could make great cuts. He could hit little creases. He was not a turnover guy. He's not going to fumble the ball. He's not going to make a lot of mistakes. And he's going to gain a lot of yardage. I can honestly say in the years that we played against him, we never stopped him.
The league allowed freshman eligibility in 1972, Griffin's first year.
Midway through that first quarter, they called Griffin, and I just knew they weren't talking to me since I was a fifth-team tailback and on the scout squad. They just couldn't admit me and had fumbled the week before. Just couldn't admit me, so I hesitated, and they kept calling my name. And at that time, I was the only Griffin on the team. Went up to Coach Hayes. He grabbed me by the shoulder pad, told me to go in at tailback. I went to run out onto the field. One of my teammates called me back because in all the excitement, I had forgotten to take my helmet with me. Couldn't believe that it meant for me to go into the game, and I got myself together, went into the game, and I was really in a daze the whole time, but my number was being called, and I was running with the football, and that game I had, in the fourth quarter, and beginning of the fourth quarter when I came out, the 86,000 fans that were in Ohio Stadium that day gave me a standing ovation because that was the day that I came in and rushed for 239 yards, which at that time was an Ohio State rushing record. And it was just a marvelous feeling, and to believe that that would happen in my freshman year was really unbelievable.
In his career, Griffin amassed 5,589 yards in 924 attempts, a superhuman record. He became the only player in collegiate history to win the Heisman Trophy twice, in 1974 and 75. Setting a precedent that may never be surpassed.
Winning the Heisman to me really reflected the situation that I was in during my years at Ohio State University, playing for a guy like Coach Woody Hayes.
The 1978 season was the last for Woody Hayes as coach of the Buckeyes.
When Woody retired and his players had a tremendous banquet for him in Columbus, he said, "I'll tell you, the 1969 team was tremendous." And he looked down at me, he says, "Damn you, Bo, you will never win a bigger game than that." And he's right. I never did win a bigger game than that one.
Bo found himself the dean of Big Ten coaches, but still lacked one prize, the Rose Bowl trophy. His 1980 team took care of that situation. Illinois entered the age of the quarterback under Coach Mike White in the early 80s. In 1983, they had a perfect conference season.
I don't think anything that I've done since or before could ever match that whole season. Illinois hadn't been in the Rose Bowl in over 20 years, and we accomplished a lot that season. We beat every Big Ten team. We beat Michigan and Ohio State coming back to beat Ohio State in the last seconds of the game. Our fans tore the goalposts down, I think, 4 or 5 times during the season.
We thought we threw a lot of passes at that time, back in the mid-'60s. Now, as you look back, they're breaking our records after 1.5 years of 2 years of playing.
And I think it changed the Big Ten for the better. 3 yards in a cloud of dust. Power football, Michigan and Ohio State were the only teams that were going to win at that level. Iowa and Illinois came in and changed that by throwing the football.
In 1985, Iowa coach Hayden Fry led his team past the defensive domination of Michigan.
Well, I know the game when we were ranked #1 in the nation back in about 1985, and the University of Michigan was ranked #2. This was a fantastic football game. Entertainment, great defense, great offense, very few mistakes. And we won the game on the last play of the game, 12-10, had to come from behind, and Rob Houtland kicks a field goal. And that propelled us into the Rose Bowl that year. That will always be remembered as one of the great victories. And when we slipped in with a championship, it showed the other teams in the Big Ten that they too could be successful and go. And certainly Wisconsin and Penn State and Michigan State also in recent years and Illinois have been to the Rose Bowl since our first chance back in 1981.
The 1980s continued the tradition of superb Big Ten coaching and superstar running backs. Indiana's Bill Mallory had Anthony Thompson, the first 2-time league MVP since Archie Griffin. George Perlis led Michigan State's program with Lorenzo White.
I never wanted it to be my program. I wanted it to be a continuation of Biggie and Duffy because those were my 2 mentors.
After 21 seasons and undefeated league campaigns in 88 and 89, Bo Schembechler quit while he was on top.
We all went through this together, and that esprit de corps in football, when it's done right, second to none.
As the Big Ten entered the 1990s, it made the biggest move in over 40 years. The leadership of the league, the Council of 10, voted to integrate the Pennsylvania State University into conference membership.
We had been looking around as to whether life was good enough as an independent. So we sat around one day and we said, okay, let's say we want to be in a conference. Which conference would be the one that would be best suited for us? And we all agreed that it would be the Big Ten if they would have us.
The addition of Penn State was very healthy for the Big Ten, academically and from an intercollegiate athletic standpoint.
The hero of Michigan's 1991 season was decided in one play. On a third down against Notre Dame, the team went not for first down, but for the game. At the season's end, Desmond Howard accepted his Heisman Trophy. 31 years after its last taste of conference victory, the Wisconsin team prevailed in 1993. Coach of the Year Barry Alvarez led his team to a Rose Bowl win and a place of honor among conference peers once again.
There's no feeling like taking the field at the Rose Bowl with the sun setting, and particularly that day when 3/4 of the stadium was red. And we used the theme that it was our home stadium. It was Camp Randall West. And just the tradition, the overall tradition of the Rose Bowl, I think is something that I'll always remember, and I think that young people were brought up on, particularly in our part of the country.
In 1994, only its second of conference play, Penn State staked its claim.
I think it was one of the great seasons that I've been involved with. We just had so many wonderful players. John Carter, I don't think there's any question, it has to go down as one of the great backs, not only for Penn State of all time. Kerry Collins has played quarterback as well as anybody we've ever had around here play, and as well as most anybody I've seen.
Seeing Coach Paterno win the Rose Bowl, to see him win a fourth major bowl and to become the winningest bowl coach in the history of college football, I think I was glad to be really glad to be a part of that, and knowing that I helped in that was really a great feeling.
The Big Ten continues its journey, creating history along the way. Its members look back with pride at all that has been accomplished in 100 years and towards all the excitement that lay ahead. This is Big Ten football.